The final crossing. 15 minutes to eternity. The entertainment lounge pulsed with music and laughter as MS Estonia cut through the black waters of the Baltic Sea. Families finished their dinners. Truckers settled into their cabins after loading their vehicles below deck. Nobody noticed the grinding sound deep in the ship's hull. Nobody felt the first surge of seawater rushing into the car deck. Within 15 minutes, one of Europe's most modern ferries would become a tomb, tilting into the abyss so fast that passengers would climb walls like mountain faces, their screams swallowed by the roar of the ocean. This is the story of September 28, 1994, when 989 souls sailed into the night, and only 137 would see the morning sun. Captain Arvo Andresson stood on the bridge of MS Estonia, watching the lights of Tallinn fade into the darkness behind them. It was 7:15 p.m. on September 27, 1994, and everything was routine. The 15,598-ton ferry had made this journey between Tallinn, Estonia and Stockholm, Sweden hundreds of times. Tonight would be no different, or so everyone believed. The ship was filled with life. In the conference rooms, Swedish businessmen discussed deals over cognac. Young couples danced in the Admiral Disco on Deck 7, the bass thumping through the walls. Families with children settled into their cramped cabins, preparing for the overnight voyage. Down on Deck 1, the vehicle deck, dozens of semi-trucks sat parked in neat rows, their precious cargo secured for the journey across the Baltic. Among the passengers was Kent Harstedt, a 28-year-old Swedish rock musician returning home from a tour. He'd performed in Tallinn and was exhausted but exhilarated. His band had been well received, and he was already planning their next trip to the newly independent Baltic states. Kent grabbed a beer from the bar and found a quiet corner to write in his journal, documenting the adventure. In another part of the ship, Silva Linda, a young Swedish woman, sat with her friend, discussing their trip to Estonia. They'd explored the medieval streets of Tallinn, bought amber jewelry, and photographed the ancient city walls. Now they were eager to get home to Stockholm, to develop their film and share stories with friends who'd never been brave enough to visit the former Soviet territories. Down in the economy cabins, dozens of Estonian workers made themselves as comfortable as possible in the cheap accommodations. They were heading to Sweden for construction jobs, agricultural work, anything that paid better than what was available in their struggling homeland. Estonia had only been independent for 3 years, and the economy was still finding its footing. These men and women were economic migrants, seeking better lives across the sea. Third Officer Tormi Ainsalu made his rounds, checking various stations throughout the massive ship. At 32, he was experienced and competent, having worked on ferries for nearly a decade. He exchanged brief words with crew members, ensured that safety protocols were being followed, and returned to the bridge to report that all was well. Everything was exactly as it should be. The Estonia cruised at roughly 15 knots through increasingly rough seas. The weather forecast had warned of strong winds and high waves, normal autumn conditions in the Baltic. The ship was built to handle much worse. Its bow visor, a massive steel door covering the bow ramp, was designed to keep water out even in the most extreme conditions. The ship had survived countless storms. Tonight's weather was merely unpleasant, not dangerous. As midnight approached, most passengers had retired to their cabins. The disco still thumped with music, but the crowd had thinned considerably. In the cafeteria, a few night owls nursed coffees and played cards. The ship's casino had closed for the night. The Estonia settled into the quiet rhythm of a vessel crossing dark waters, while its cargo of humanity slept. Nobody heard the metallic groaning deep in the ship's bow. Nobody noticed the subtle vibrations that shouldn't have been there. The bow visor, weighing 55 tons of steel, was slowly tearing away from its locking mechanisms. Years of stress, inadequate maintenance, and the constant pounding of Baltic waves had weakened the critical attachment points. With each wave that struck the bow, the visor shifted slightly, grinding against metal that was never meant to move. At approximately 1 a.m. on September 28th, passengers in forward cabins began to notice unusual sounds. Some described it as metal scraping against metal. Others said it sounded like a car accident in slow motion. A few concerned passengers ventured into the hallways, looking for crew members to ask about the noise. They were reassured that everything was fine, that old ships make strange sounds in rough seas. But everything was not fine. At 1:15 a.m., the bow visor tore completely away from MS Estonia. 55 tons of steel crashed into the black waters of the Baltic Sea, leaving the bow ramp, the ship's inner door, as the only barrier between the ocean and the vehicle deck. The bow ramp was never designed to withstand the full force of ocean waves. It was meant to be protected by the visor. Within seconds, massive waves began hammering the exposed bow ramp. On the bridge, alarms suddenly screamed to life. Captain Andre's son and his crew stared at their instruments in disbelief as sensors indicated catastrophic flooding on the vehicle deck. This was impossible. Modern ferries didn't just flood. There had to be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Water exploded through the failing bow ramp with the force of a dam breaking. It rushed across the vehicle deck in a torrent, a wall of seawater weighing thousands of tons. The semi-trucks, secured with chains and straps, began shifting as water swirled around their wheels. The Estonia, top-heavy by design to accommodate passenger decks, began to list to starboard. In their cabins, passengers woke to chaos. The ship was tilting. Objects slid across tables. Suitcases tumbled from overhead racks. The angle increased with terrifying speed. 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. People stumbled from their beds, struggling to understand what was happening. Kent Harstedt had been sleeping when his body rolled against the cabin wall. His eyes snapped open. The room was at an angle that made no sense. He heard screaming in the hallway, the sound of breaking glass, the groan of metal under impossible stress. He grabbed for his clothes, but the ship lurched again, throwing him across the cabin. There was no time for clothes. No time for anything. He had to get out. Silva Linda and her friend were trapped in their cabin as the door jammed shut from the ship's twisted frame. They screamed and pounded on the door, but the metal wouldn't budge. Water began seeping under the door frame. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the ship into darkness broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. On the bridge, Captain Andre's son made a desperate mayday call. "Mayday, mayday, Estonia. We have a severe list to starboard. We need immediate assistance." The time was 1:22 a.m. The Estonia had been flooding for 7 minutes. The list was approaching 30 degrees. Third Officer Einsalu tried to make his way down to the vehicle deck to assess the damage, but it was impossible. The ship was tilting so severely that the corridors had become vertical shafts. He clung to railings, trying to pull himself forward, but physics was against him. Behind him, he heard the sounds he would never forget. Hundreds of people screaming in darkness, calling for loved ones, begging for help that wasn't coming. In the engine room, crew members fought to keep the generators running. If they lost power completely, the emergency systems would fail. pumps would stop. The ship would become a tomb of absolute darkness. They worked frantically, these men deep in the bowels of the dying vessel, knowing that with each passing second their own escape became less likely. At 1:30 a.m., just 15 minutes after the visor tore away, the Estonia was listing at 50 to 60 degrees. The ship was practically on its side. Walking was impossible. The interior had become a nightmare landscape where floors were walls and walls were ceilings. People who'd made it into the hallways found themselves in vertical tunnels, climbing over bodies of those who'd fallen, pulling themselves hand over hand toward some imagined safety. The maritime rule is simple: evacuate to the muster stations, then to the lifeboats. But there were no muster stations anymore. The starboard side of the ship was underwater. The port side was pointed at the sky. Of the Estonia's lifeboats, only a few on the port side could possibly be launched, and launching them from a ship on its side was virtually impossible. Some passengers made it to the upper decks through sheer determination and luck. They climbed staircases that had become ladder-like as the ship rolled. They pulled themselves through doors that opened into space, crawling onto what had been the side of the ship but was now the highest point. These people, fewer than 200 out of nearly 1,000, were the only ones with any chance of survival. Kent Harstedt climbed through a window that had shattered during the chaos. He pulled himself onto the hull of the ship, which was now exposed above the waterline. All around him, people were sliding down the steel slope into the churning sea. The water temperature was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a person in less than an hour. The waves were 20 feet high. The wind howled at 30 knots. It was a hell of water and darkness and dying. Silva Linda and her friend finally broke through their cabin door just as water rushed into the corridor. They swam more than walked, pulled along by the current as the ship continued its death roll. They reached a stairwell, now a vertical shaft, and began climbing. Behind them, the water rose. They could hear it, a roar like a living thing, chasing them up through the ship. At 1:50 a.m., the Estonia capsized completely, rolling onto its side and beginning to sink. People still trapped inside had seconds left. The ship groaned, a sound witnesses would describe as a scream, as its superstructure collapsed under the pressure. Air pockets imploded. Watertight doors that might have saved compartments had been left open in the panic. The sea rushed in to claim the Estonia entirely. Those who'd made it outside faced an equally terrible fate. They were in the Baltic Sea in the middle of the night during a storm. The waves tossed them like toys. The cold knifed through their bodies, shutting down muscles, slowing thoughts, stealing life degree by degree. Some clung to debris. Others found life rafts that had automatically inflated. Many simply swam in the darkness, hoping for rescue they couldn't see or hear. Kent Harstedt found himself in the water, gasping from the cold shock. He was a strong swimmer, but in these conditions strength meant nothing. He could see the lights of the sinking ship, people still clinging to the hull, their screams carried on the wind. He swam away from the ship, knowing that when it went down completely, it would create suction that could pull him under. Silva Linda surfaced, coughing seawater, her lungs burning from the cold. Her friend was gone. She'd lost her in the chaos of the sinking, somewhere in that nightmare of tilting corridors and rising water. Silva was alone in the dark sea, one small human in an ocean that didn't care whether she lived or died. The Estonia sank at approximately 2 a.m., just 45 minutes after the bow visor had torn away. Where a massive ferry had been, there was now only darkness, debris, and hundreds of people dying in the Baltic Sea. The first rescue ships arrived around 2:40 a.m. The Finnish ferry Mariella, the Swedish ship Isabella, and various other vessels converged on the coordinates, their searchlights cutting through the night. What they found was horror beyond imagination. Bodies floating face down in life jackets. Survivors clinging to life rafts so overcrowded that people had to take turns in the water. Hypothermia victims who were technically alive, but so far gone they couldn't speak or move. Helicopter pilots from Finland and Sweden performed acts of extraordinary courage, lowering rescue swimmers into violent seas, pulling frozen survivors from the water one by one. But the conditions made rescue agonizingly slow. High waves and darkness meant that for every person they saved, they could see dozens they couldn't reach in time. Kent Harstedt had been in the water for nearly an hour when a searchlight found him. He was picked up by rescue helicopter at 3:18 a.m., so hypothermic that he couldn't feel his limbs. The rescue swimmer later said that Kent had maybe 10 more minutes before the cold would have stopped his heart. In the helicopter, they wrapped him in thermal blankets and radioed ahead to have medical teams ready. Silva Linda was pulled from a life raft at 4:05 a.m. She'd shared the raft with 11 other people, but 3 had died during the wait for rescue, their bodies kept in the raft because there was nowhere else to put them. Silva was crying, though no tears came. Her body was too cold to produce them. She kept asking about her friend, but nobody had answers. As dawn broke on September 28th, the rescue ships continued pulling survivors from the water, but they were also recovering far more bodies. The sea was littered with the dead, men in suits, women in nightgowns, children still clutching teddy bears. Many wore life jackets but had died anyway, killed by hypothermia before rescue could reach them. By 8 a.m., the maritime authorities made the grim determination that no more living survivors would be found. People can survive in 50-degree water for approximately 1 hour, perhaps 2 if they're lucky and strong. It had been more than 6 hours since the sinking. Anyone still in the water was dead. The final count was devastating. Of 989 people aboard the Estonia, only 137 survived. 852 people died. 757 passengers and 95 crew members. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in European history, worse than the Titanic in terms of the percentage of people lost. The cold water had been the killer. Many people who'd successfully evacuated the ship died anyway, floating in their life jackets as hypothermia shut down their bodies. Among the dead were entire families. The true family, parents and 2 children, all perished. Business executives on their way to Stockholm for meetings. Estonian workers seeking better lives in Sweden. Young couples on romantic getaways. Elderly passengers traveling to visit family. The sea took them all indiscriminately. Third Officer Tormi Ainselu survived, one of only 26 crew members who made it out alive. He was rescued at 5:30 a.m., pulled from a life raft where half the occupants were already dead. In later interviews, he would describe the sounds of that night, the screaming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the groaning of the ship as it died, the silence that fell when the Estonia finally slipped beneath the waves. Captain Arvo Andre's son did not survive. He was last seen on the bridge, still trying to send distress signals as the ship rolled onto its side. His body was recovered 3 days later, still wearing his captain's uniform. The investigation into the Estonia disaster began immediately, but it would be plagued by controversy from the start. The official joint investigation by Sweden, Finland, and Estonia concluded that the bow visor had failed due to inadequate locking mechanisms and the ship's design flaws. The visor tore away, the bow ramp collapsed under wave pressure, and the vehicle deck flooded with catastrophic speed. But many survivors and victims' families believed there was more to the story. Some claimed they'd heard explosions before the ship listed. Others suggested that illegal cargo, possibly military equipment, was being transported and that a collision or incident related to this cargo caused the disaster. The Swedish government classified much of the information about the Estonia, and the wreck site was declared a grave, with a treaty among Baltic nations prohibiting diving or disturbing the ship. These actions fueled conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Documentaries have claimed to show evidence of a hole in the hull that couldn't have been caused by the bow visor failure. Families of victims have demanded that the ship be raised and properly investigated. The Swedish government has consistently refused, citing the sanctity of the grave site and the stability of the official investigation's conclusions. Regardless of the exact cause, the facts remained brutal. The Estonia sank in 15 minutes, so fast that passengers trapped below decks had virtually no chance of escape. The ship's design, with its vehicle deck directly open to the bow, meant that any compromise to the bow doors would result in catastrophic flooding. And the cold Baltic waters meant that even those who escaped the ship had only minutes to survive before hypothermia killed them. Kent Harstedt returned to Sweden and spent months in therapy, dealing with survivors' guilt and PTSD. He never performed music again. In interviews years later, he described how the sounds of that night still haunted him: the screaming, the metal groaning, the splash of bodies hitting the water. He moved to the countryside, away from the sea, and rarely spoke about the Estonia. Silva Linda learned that her friend had not survived. Her body was recovered 2 weeks after the sinking, floating 50 miles from the disaster site. Silva attended the funeral, met her friend's family, and tried to explain what had happened that night. But how do you explain chaos? How do you put words to the moment when a ship becomes a death trap and the ocean becomes a predator? The disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. New requirements for bow visor locking mechanisms were implemented. Regular inspections became mandatory. Ships were required to improve their watertight integrity and evacuation procedures. But these changes came too late for the 852 people who died on the Estonia. Memorials were erected in Stockholm, Tallinn, and along the Swedish coast. Each September 28th, survivors and families gather to remember those lost. Names are read aloud, all 852 of them. It takes hours. Some families place flowers in the Baltic Sea, sending them to float toward the spot where the Estonia rests, 260 feet below the surface. The wreck lies on the seabed, still containing the remains of hundreds of victims who were never recovered. It's a tomb of steel and bone, protected by international treaty, visited only by the creatures of the deep. Divers who've illegally explored the site describe it as eerie beyond words. A massive ship lying on its side, windows dark and empty, corridors filled with silt and death. Statistics can't capture the human dimension of disaster. 852 deaths is a number, but each one was a person with dreams, fears, loved ones, and futures that would never happen. The Estonia disaster destroyed families, devastated communities, and left psychological scars that endure 30 years later. Among the victims were the Johansson family, parents Bjorn and Anna with their 2 children, Eric, 8, and Lisa, 5. They were returning from a vacation in Tallinn. Their extended family in Stockholm waited at the dock for a ship that never arrived. Alexei Petrov, a 34-year-old Estonian construction worker heading to Stockholm for a job that would have paid enough to bring his wife and daughter to Sweden. His daughter was 3 years old when he died. She's now in her 30s, living with the absence of a father she barely remembers. Eva Lindström, a 62-year-old Swedish teacher who'd spent her life savings on a trip to the newly opened Baltic states. She'd written in her journal about how exciting it was to see history being made, to visit places that had been closed to Westerners for decades. Her journal was recovered with her body. The survivors carry their own burdens. Many developed what's now recognized as severe PTSD. Some became unable to travel by boat or even to be near large bodies of water. Marriages crumbled under the stress of trauma. Survivors groups formed, providing support and advocacy, but also serving as a constant reminder of the worst night of their lives. There's a particular cruelty in the randomness of who lived and who died. Physical strength mattered. Those who could climb through the tilting ship, who could pull themselves onto the hull, who could survive in the cold water longer. But luck mattered more. Being in the right cabin, near the right exit, making the right split-second decisions in absolute chaos, these factors determined everything. Some people survived who shouldn't have, by any logical accounting. A 74-year-old woman was pulled from the water after nearly 2 hours, her body temperature so low that doctors thought she was dead. She recovered. Meanwhile, a 25-year-old Olympic swimmer, someone in peak physical condition, was found dead in his life jacket, killed by hypothermia within the first hour. The psychological impact extended beyond survivors and victims' families. The rescue workers who pulled bodies from the sea, the investigators who examined the wreck, the medical personnel who treated the survivors, all of them carried trauma from the Estonia. Rescue helicopter pilots described having nightmares for years afterward, dreaming of searchlights finding faces in dark water, reaching for people they couldn't save. For the Baltic nations, the disaster became a defining moment. Estonia was a newly independent country, still finding its place in Europe. The loss of so many Estonian citizens on a voyage to Sweden, a symbol of the new connections being formed, was devastating to national morale. In Sweden, the Estonia disaster became part of the national consciousness, referenced in the same breath as other defining tragedies. The Estonia taught the maritime world harsh lessons about ship design, safety culture, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. But it also revealed something about human nature, both the worst and the best. There were reports of people pushing others aside to reach exits, of stronger passengers climbing over weaker ones in the chaos. But there were also stories of extraordinary altruism, crew members who stayed to help passengers evacuate, knowing they were sacrificing their own chances of survival. Passengers who gave up their positions on life rafts to others. Strangers who held each other in the water, sharing body heat, refusing to let go even as the cold pulled them toward death. Michael Aun, a crew member who survived, described helping an elderly woman climb through a window even as the ship rolled beneath them. He could have left her. She was slow, panicked, hampering his escape. Instead, he stayed with her, pulled her through the window, helped her onto the hull. They were separated in the water, and he doesn't know if she survived. But he knew he'd made the right choice, even if it had nearly cost him his life. These stories matter because they remind us that even in the worst moments, humans are capable of seeing each other's humanity. The Estonia could have been a story only of panic and selfishness. Instead, it's also a story of people choosing to help strangers when every survival instinct screamed at them to save only themselves. The technical lessons were equally important. The Estonia showed that modern ships aren't unsinkable, that safety systems can fail catastrophically, and that 15 minutes from normal to catastrophic is possible if the right weaknesses align. Naval architects studied the disaster, redesigning bow visor systems and vehicle deck configurations. Maritime law was rewritten to require better watertight integrity. But there's a larger lesson that extends beyond ships and seas. The Estonia reminds us that we live in a world where catastrophe is always possible, where the difference between life and death can come down to seconds and luck, where 800 people can go to sleep thinking about tomorrow and never wake up. This reality is uncomfortable. We build routines and systems that make us feel safe, that hide from us how fragile existence actually is. The Estonia stripped away those illusions for everyone who experienced it. Survivors, witnesses, rescuers, and all who heard about it. The ship sank in 15 minutes. Hundreds died despite doing everything right. The sea didn't care about fairness or justice or who deserved to survive. Yet people continue to travel by ship. The Baltic ferries still run their routes, carrying passengers who've largely forgotten about the Estonia, or who never knew about it in the first place. Life continues because it must, because we can't live in constant awareness of catastrophe. We move forward, we take calculated risks, we trust in systems and statistics and our own luck. The Estonia rests on the seabed, a monument to those 852 people and a warning to everyone who comes after. The sea holds many such monuments, ships and submarines and the people they took. They're reminders that human engineering, courage and determination are powerful, but they're not omnipotent. Nature, whether as cold water, high waves, or a storm in the night, remains the ultimate authority. 30 years have passed since the Estonia sank. The survivors are older now, many dealing with health problems exacerbated by that night of hypothermia and trauma. Some have passed away, taking their memories with them. The children who lost parents on the Estonia are now adults with children of their own, passing down stories of grandparents they never knew. In Stockholm, there's a memorial garden where victims' names are engraved on stones arranged in a pattern that, from above, resembles a ship. Visitors leave flowers, notes, photographs. On September 28th each year, hundreds gather there, a community of loss that spans 3 decades. The Swedish government continues to maintain that the investigation was thorough and the conclusions accurate. Conspiracy theorists continue to demand that the wreck be examined more closely. This debate will likely continue as long as anyone remembers the Estonia, which may be forever. Some disasters are too large, too tragic, to fade from collective memory. If you dive down to the Estonia, which you legally cannot and should not, you would find a ship slowly being consumed by the sea. Metal corrodes, structures collapse, the Baltic's cold waters preserve and destroy in equal measure. Inside, if you could navigate the darkness and silt, you would find the possessions people died with, suitcases still packed, shoes that will never be worn, toys clutched in small hands. The Estonia is a grave, but it's also evidence of a moment when everything went wrong. It's a time capsule of September 28, 1994, a night when a routine ferry crossing became one of Europe's worst maritime disasters. Those who survived carry the Estonia with them every day. It's in the hesitation before boarding a boat, in the nightmares that still come decades later, in the way they hold their loved ones a little tighter, knowing how quickly everything can change. They are living witnesses to catastrophe, reminders that disaster doesn't announce itself, doesn't give fair warning, doesn't discriminate. The last words recorded from the Estonia came from Captain Andressen's final Mayday call. "We need immediate assistance." It was a plea that couldn't be answered in time. Rescue ships arrived, helicopters searched. Brave people did everything humanly possible, but for 852 people, it wasn't enough. They needed assistance in 15 minutes, and help took 45. The Estonia disappeared into the Baltic Sea on that September night, taking with it nearly 1,000 people who'd boarded expecting an ordinary crossing. What they got instead was 15 minutes of chaos, followed by an eternity of cold, dark water. Some fought and survived. Most fought and died. All of them deserved better. The sea keeps its secrets, the Estonia keeps its dead, and those of us on the surface keep their memory. That's all we can do. Remember, honor, and learn. And perhaps most importantly, we can recognize that we live on borrowed time in a dangerous world, and that every ordinary moment, every routine ferry crossing, every normal day, is a gift that can be taken away in 15 minutes. The lights of Stockholm still shine across the Baltic waters. The ferries still run their routes. Life continues. But below, in the cold and dark, the Estonia rests with its 852 souls, a monument to how quickly safety can become catastrophe, and how the sea, ultimately, always wins. If this story moved you, please leave a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most gripping disasters and mysteries. The survivors of the Estonia want the world to remember what happened that night. Your engagement helps keep their stories alive. What do you think happened? Was the official investigation complete, or are there still questions that deserve answers? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember, every day above the water is a gift. Stay safe out there.